Did God have a wife? So let's start off with who is Asherah? So Asherah was the great goddess in ancient West Semitic religion. So Semitic lands are across the Fertile Crescent. In the east is Mesopotamia, the west is Syria and Canaan. And so in the western portion especially, Asherah was venerated as the great goddess. However, she's also known in the rest of the Semitic lands too. Her epithets include Elat, which means goddess. So that's the feminine form in the Semitic word El, meaning God. And so Elat, the feminine form of that. She's known as Athirat, so obviously related word is Asherah in the Ugaritic texts. And so Ugarit is an early and important Bronze Age mercantile city in Syria, where were found all sorts of, when it was destroyed, all of these texts were found, which actually gives us a lot more ancient Semitic texts than we'd had before it, especially in the West Semitic lands. Unfortunately, we don't have a great survival of the libraries and consequently of the mythology. So in Ugarit, she is portrayed as the wife, the consort of the great god El, and she's called, for example, the mother of the gods. This is an image of her from an ivory box found near Ugarit in Syria. In the Baal cycle of myths from Ugarit, Asherah or Athirat is also the mother of many of the gods, including the sea or the chaos god Yam, who is also fights in the Baal saga against Baal. And Asherah tends to favor Yam in his fights against Baal. And so that, is reminiscent, in Greek mythology of how Hera, who's the queen of the gods, often has sons who are fighting against kind of hero warrior gods or demigods like Hercules or Perseus, who are sons of Zeus who are fighting against Hera's various champions. So Asherah's symbols include especially trees. And so these include date palms. So for example, in this artifact from Canaan, from Israel, from the Jordan Valley, you can see kind of in between in the middle of this, there's two figurines in relief. Those are female figures, and in between them, there's kind of scratch marks, which is a indication of like a tree or a date palm tree. So this is thought to be a representation of Asherah. And so trees, oaks, almonds, and she was frequently represented symbolically with a pole that represents a tree. Also in the different imagery, the artifacts, archaeological artifacts, as a creator goddess, as a mother goddess, she's associated with all sorts of fertility, including the fertility of the land, but especially and animals and things, but also human fertility. So for the need that people have had in order to reproduce and the troubles that are sometimes associated with that, including infant mortality, but also just being unable to have children. So she's associated with gaining fertility. And so triangles, vaginal symbols are also associated with Asherah and her artifacts archaeologically. But one of the main artifacts that she's associated with are these Judean pillar figures, as they've been called. And so these are kind of clay figurines with exaggerated breasts, especially with a little head. Sometimes it's just very hardly indicated or symbolically indicated. And these it turns out, are very ubiquitous household items found in everyday people's houses in numbers of hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands total, across Canaan at the various archaeological sites, for example, in Judah, beginning in the 10th century BC, and then actually all the way down to the end of the First Temple period. And so definitely an artifact that's associated with Canaanite, Israelite religion, the common people's religion, and that has been identified and the fertility rites of worship with Asherah, so symbols of Asherah. Asherah is in the Bible, although if you're an English speaker, her appearance in the Bible has sometimes been hidden. So in the Hebrew Bible, the name Asherah appears some 40 times, making her among the most referenced gods or names of gods, alongside, of course, Yahweh and El, who was originally a different god than Yahweh, but who has merged with Yahweh in the biblical text, and Baal, who is portrayed anyway in the Bible as a rival of Yahweh. Because the word Asherah is frequently translated as grove of trees, in both the Septuagint, the original ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and then carried through into the King James Version, which is for many centuries anyway, the familiar English standard. As a result of that, people reading the Old Testament in English, the name would be lost to them. The Bible obscures that because it'll just say something like grove instead of Asherah. So for example, in the King James Version of the book of Exodus, chapter 34, we read this commandment: "Observe thou, which I command thee this day. Behold, I drive out before thee the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. For thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." So the God here of Israel is commanding the Israelites who are going through the Exodus here from Egypt and into the land of Canaan to cut down the groves, it's saying here, in addition to the altars and images of the different gods of the people who were there before they are there. So this same verse, rendered in the New International Version, we read these same verses: "Obey what I command you today. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles." So not their groves, but their Asherah poles. "Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." Similarly, in the book of Kings, in the King James Version, we read, "Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him." So this is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. "And he, Ahab, reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, the capital of Israel. Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord of Israel, the Lord God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him." So if we read that in the New International Version, we're going to hear it as, instead of that, "Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any those before him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole, and he did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel before him." Also, for example, when King Josiah, one of the later kings, last kings of Judah, cleanses the temple in Jerusalem, It reads in the King James versions of the book of 2 Kings, "And he, King Josiah, brought out the wooden image from the house of the Lord to the brook Kidron outside Jerusalem. He burned it at the brook Kidron and ground it to ashes and threw its ashes on the graves of the common people." He's just totally defiling the wooden image and in its ashes. "Then he tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons that were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the wooden image." Oh, that was the New King James Version. I was going to switch it to King James. But anyway, you get the idea. It's in the grove. Or, in the New King James, they to make it wooden image. In the original King James, that would have said the grove. So it changes now in the modern translation, the New International Version here. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, the quarters where the women did weaving for Asherah. And so this is one of these examples that we see of ancient Near Eastern paganism, where part of the system is that there are, male and female in some cases, but in the case of the Jerusalem temple here, male shrine prostitutes in the temple, as well as then quarters for women who are weaving garments for Asherah, the goddess Asherah here. And so this is indicating, sometimes people will suggest that the archaeology, all of those Asherah figures, they'll suggest, well, sure, there's a lot of backsliding among the common people. All of the common Israelite women maybe are superstitious and have these little Asherah figurines for their fertility, but it's just a ignorance on the rural people or something like that. But actually, the Bible itself here is saying no. This is Asherah worship is patronized by the royal family and actually has a special group of women that are set to weave clothing for the cult object, the idol, the Asherah pole that is placed in the temple itself, the Jerusalem temple itself. So, like I say, the word here rendered as grove in the King James Version and the Asherah pole in the New International Version is actually just Asherah, or the plural Asherim, which is literally the name of the goddess. So even though the newer translation says Asherah pole, the pole part is simply inferred. So the idea is that it's understood that Asherah is worshipped in the poles, and this is like an artist's reconstruction of maybe what such a pole as a Asherah idol would look like. And so the object removed from the temple here by Josiah, in that passage we just read, near the end of the first temple period, was likely then a pole representing the goddess who had been worshipped in the Jerusalem temple. So Asherah was also patronized by royal women. So again, as a biblical account, we read that royal women were sometimes supporting Asherah or worshipped specifically at her cult. And so King Asa of Judah actually disposes his grandmother from the position of queen mother because of her sponsorship or patronage of Asherah. So Asa, the king, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done, according to, the narrator of the Bible's perspective. He expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land, and he got rid of all of the idols his ancestors had made. He even deposed his grandmother Maakah from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive image for the worship of Asherah. Asa cut it down and burned it in the Kidron Valley. So there's an echo here of Josiah's burning of an Asherah. Asa here is doing the same thing with a an image of Asherah in the temple. Because of when the Bible's written, the story about Josiah, which is kind of contemporary to the biblical authorship, that's a historical story. The story of Asa doing the same thing is probably a legendary story that is modeled on the thing that Josiah did. That's why they both cut down an Asherah image and burned it in the Kidron Valley. So, nevertheless, throughout the First Temple period, we also hear of Israelite women worshiping the Queen of Heaven. And one of the ways they do that is by making cakes impressed with her image. And so, for example, we read in Jeremiah 44:8. So Jeremiah is a prophet who's existing at the end of the First Temple period. So this is still happening all the way up to the end of the First Temple period. In that book we read, "The women said, 'When we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did not our husbands know that we were making cakes impressed with her image and pouring out drink offerings to her?'" So while, in the Bible here, when there's talking about women baking cakes as a kind of worship, or making cakes, the Queen of Heaven in these passages is not explicitly named, and in the ancient Near Eastern and Semitic pantheons, there's other goddesses who claim the title Queen of Heaven. Nevertheless, because of the reduction of the pantheon and the prominence of Asherah in kind of the Western Semitic, Canaanite, Israelite times here, most scholars identify this particular practice with Asherah. And just speaking of this practice of making cakes, you may even remember that when God comes and visits Abraham and Sarah and is going to tell Sarah that she will eventually give birth to a son and that sort of thing, and they're on their way, God, in the form of three beings, three angels, is on the way to the city of Sodom. That part of what Abraham does is he goes to Sarah and says, "Quick, go and bake cakes." And so that's something that Sarah does to present to God in Genesis. So let's just ground ourselves a little bit here as we are thinking about the time period of the biblical composition. And so if we go from this period of time in 1200 BCE, this time period that caused where there was a major calamity in the Mediterranean world, it's called the Bronze Age collapse. This is a time period when the Hittite Empire falls, the Mycenaeans and Minoans fall. There's a lot of collapse of different societies. However, the Egyptians are able to stave it off, and they record that they fought off attacks from a people called the Sea Peoples. And then shortly after, one of these Sea Peoples, maybe the Peleset, the Philistines, we presume, the Egyptians have them colonize or give to them kind of the coast of Canaan, Philistia, or Palestine as it becomes, based on that kind of time and invasion. So that's the time period of that collapse. That's the time period when the Trojan War is set, the historic kernel for the Trojan War, which is very different from how the book that actually later gets composed, the epic that later gets composed 500 years later by Homer or the oral poets. And in between, there's this dark age of Greece, and we can kind of see that atop that. Meanwhile, if we think about it in terms of biblical authorship, there are some of the components of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the earliest components are being composed at the end of this First Temple period. So I'm writing those down here at the bottom line here, is where it's saying DTR 1, Deuteronomy 2. That is maybe when the earliest drafts of the Deuteronomic history and Deuteronomy are being written, and maybe the final, later draft during the exile. And then finally, maybe the Torah as we have it now, compiled together as of the 5th century BCE with the time of Ezra, long after the exiles have returned and are back in Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple in the Second Temple period under the Persians. But the period of time, especially when like the beginnings of biblical text are being written, is this period that happens after the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, when there is a flowering of the kingdom of Judah. And we can kind of see here at that end of the First Temple period, the reigns of Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah, which are going to be really important for all this. So I just want to ground ourselves in that as we're thinking about the context of Asherah worship. And so if we're looking at this timeline in terms of the figurines are existing pretty much all the way from the time period of this I have grayed out here, when Saul and David and Solomon theoretically would have lived, what I'm calling a mythical united monarchy period, this time period that exists literarily in the Bible. From that time all the way down through the end there of the kingdom of Judah, 587, the fall of Jerusalem, there are these Asherah figures that exist in that time period. So before we continue on with our consideration of the Canaanite or Israelite, the Western Semitic pantheon, I want to think about pantheons that maybe we're more familiar with in the 21st century West anyway. So the old gods continue to live on in fiction. So for example, Loki and Thor are popularized in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that is giving modern people a pretty opaque window, I think, into Old Norse mythology. So the superheroes here are very different than what they would have been like in Old Norse myths, but at least you are hearing all of those kinds of words and getting some of the characteristics. We're remembering those names, Loki and Thor. And while those Norse gods have been reborn as superheroes and supervillains, along with other portrayals of the Norse gods, and while, for example, the gods of Egypt occasionally get their own movies, not always the best movies, nevertheless, the best known pantheon of the old gods in the West probably continues to be the ancient Greek pantheon, along with their Roman counterparts, which are usually just lined up. We've done a whole big lecture where we separate ancient Greek and ancient Roman pagan religion, which is pretty popular if you haven't watched that. So a large pantheon of names really, I think, is remembered of the Greeks and Romans, along with a lot of the myths. So everyone from Artemis and Diana to Apollo, Athena, Minerva, Zeus, Jupiter, Ares, Mars, Dionysus, Bacchus, Hades, Pluto, Demeter, Ceres, Poseidon, Neptune, Hera, Juno, Aphrodite, Venus, Hermes, Mercury. A bunch of these are known better by their Greek name, I think. Like Athena is a lot better known as a name than Minerva. Sometimes I think the names are just as well known maybe for both Poseidon and Neptune and Aphrodite and Venus. Hermes and Mercury. Well, Mercury is maybe the better known name, but Hermes has, think of the myths more, that sort of a thing. The king of the gods for ancient Greeks was Zeus, and that is the equivalent of Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. So both Greek and Latin are ultimately derived from Indo-European. They're both Indo-European languages, so they have the same linguistic historical source, a source that has to be reconstructed by linguists because it was not a written language, and so the source words and grammar for it are extrapolated by linguists, but essentially the name Zeus and also Jupiter descend from this Indo-European hypothesized name for great sky father, Deus Pater, which becomes Jupiter. You can see the pater there for father in Jupiter in Latin. And that's also then, Deus there is also related to Zeus. And that's also related to the generic words for God in Greek, theos, and in Latin, deus. And so, just anyway, another way you can do that is even when you're saying Zeus pater to make Jupiter. Jupiter is just the nominative in Latin for the god's name, and all of the other case declensions, when you're saying it in any other way, when you're saying we're going to give this to Jupiter, you would use a different case, and so then it becomes, it's Jupiter Yahwis. And so when you're saying by Jove, Jove is also the name Jupiter. It's just the other form of Jupiter from Latin. So in mythology, we know probably as maybe his best characteristic after being the god of hurling thunderbolts and lightning, Zeus is known as a father, and he's a father of a huge number of other gods, including important gods like Ares and Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Athena, Hephaestus, Dionysus. And he's also the father of a bunch of heroes like Heracles and Perseus. So it's actually, you can't list all of the different Greek names. I mean, it would go on and on forever if we were going to list all of the different heroes and other figures, gods that the muses, everybody who Zeus is the father of. So he's getting around. Those are not all from one mother, however. And so as a result of the fact that there are all of these different mothers, and the fact that Zeus has a wife, Hera, who is jealous, many of the myths that we hear about Zeus in Greek mythology are Zeus assuming some form of a disguise in order to visit a lover. So for example, in this kind of philandering that happens, this kind of an amazing, I think, image from an ancient Greek pot, Zeus takes the form of a swan to seduce Leda. And Leda then has a child by him, often because he was a swan here when he seduces her. She actually gives birth to an egg, and from that egg is hatched Helen of Troy, another important figure who is a daughter of Zeus. Likewise, Zeus, in the form of a bull, is very famous for carrying off maiden Europa. There's a lot of paintings called The Rape of Europa. And Europa gives birth to King Minos of Troy. Minos is the father, I think, of the Minotaur, who builds the labyrinth in Crete. Sorry, it's not King Minos of Crete, it should say, not of Troy. So King Minos of Crete. And for example, also in terms of Zeus turning into different disguises, he assumes the form of an eagle in order to abduct Ganymede. So there's multiple transformation myths. This is just a couple sample of them. Nevertheless, despite all of Zeus's philandering and worse than philandering, rape and so on, he does have a divine wife, Hera, who is jealous of her rivals and their children, which is also a common theme in courtly narratives. So one of the things that was true in ancient kingdoms, where ancient kings have multiple, all the way up until actually modern times in kingdoms anyway, where there's polygamy, where there's one king that has multiple spouses. One of the things that happens is that the different queens compete with to have their child be the heir and the favorite. And they become jealous of the others and indeed intrigue against the others. And so, for example, when Zeus has an affair with a mortal princess, Alcmene, when Alcmene gives birth to a child who is it's a twin. She also gives birth to a child, the twin brother, who is actually fathered by her mortal husband, but her divine child by Zeus. She calls him Heracles, a name that means Hera's glory, in what proves to be a very vain attempt to mollify Hera. So maybe Hera will look on this kid that is named Hera's glory and say, okay, I'll get over it because I've been, but no, not at all. So even right from birth, Hera sends a snake to come and kill him, to kill the infant. But of course, Heracles, who's going to grow up to be Hercules, has super strength and all of these powers, and so he's able to destroy the serpent sent against him. Nevertheless, throughout all of his myths, his 12 labors and so on, Hera remains an implacable enemy in the Heracles cycle of mythology. Okay, so that's mythology, and sometimes we tend to equate the old religions, paganism, only with the mythology. Mythology is the thing that we remember the most, alongside the art, the statues, the pottery, and so forth, and yet that wouldn't have been the major focus of ancient pagan religion, which is going to be more about rituals and all sorts of superstitions that you have to do so as to not incur the different enmity of the gods, the same way Heracles has the enmity of Hera all the time. You also have to do things to not offend or to appease the gods who might be coming after you. None of the myths, however, would be known if certain ancient Greek philosophers like Plato had their way. So for example, in his dialogue, The Republic, as Plato is envisioning an ideal society, he also explains how, for him, the form of the good, the eternal idea of goodness for goodness sake, that's at the apex for him of his cosmology. And he further complains in The Republic that myths that portray the gods show them behaving immorally. All of these things that Zeus is doing, cheating on Hera, raping people, kidnapping Ganymede and all the other people, disguising himself, seducing, all of these kind of deceits. That's not a thing that God would do, a true God would do, according to Plato. So yeah, we have been told these stories, but he's rejecting these stories. And in the Republic, and to have an ideal society, he feels that these ideas are so damaging that they should be censored and eliminated from the Republic, from his utopia. So he would reject the mythology because he rejects the ethics that seem to be taught in the mythology. So this didn't necessarily mean that philosophers rejected, let's say, Zeus by name. So just because they don't envision the gods the way the gods are pictured anthropomorphically in artwork or talked about, again, pretty anthropomorphically and also unethically in mythology, they didn't say that there's nothing divine, but they just proposed a different way of understanding it. So they rejected traditional Greek pagan understanding of the gods, and instead, as philosophers, proposed new ways of envisioning the divine that is in keeping with the philosophical ethics that they were developing and also the cosmology, the world as they were understanding it now through the emerging natural philosophy of ancient science. And so, for example, in another dialogue, the Timaeus, which ends up being actually very influential and known both in Islam and Christianity in the Middle Ages, Plato redefines Zeus, or the Father, as he's calling him, as the demiurge or the creator of the cosmos. So instead of seeing this anthropomorphic human guy with a beard who's wandering around philandering, we're seeing a divine craftsman who is the first cause after the source itself, after the good, who then in turn emanates, from which in turn emanates all of creation. So Plato's ideas were elaborated and built upon by later Neoplatonist philosophers, including people like Plotinus and Proclus. And in these cases, they directly identified Zeus, or then again, re-envisioning what it means to have Zeus with both the demiurge, but also with nous, with, just to say, consciousness, the divine mind of the universe. Again, the first emanation from the one source of everything. And so what I wanted to just kind of say is, this is a moving target of understanding what the gods are, even using the same name of the chief of the gods. So God here is known as the name Zeus, and the philosophical reformer here, the religious reformers who are redefining how Zeus should be understood, are giving a very different portrait than earlier myths, earlier mythology is about. And if Zeus were only known through the works of these philosophical reformers, like I said, he would be known as a divine, disembodied force, and not just as a kind of sky god philanderer with a jealous wife. So, which one of these is the true Zeus? So just because the anthropomorphic vision of Zeus, the older mythological views taught by the pagans going back into prehistory, that happened first. It has historical priority, but that doesn't mean that that vision describes the cosmos more accurately. So on the contrary, the reforming philosophers who are drawing on more information, they have more intellectual, logical tools, and have actually been able to do thoughtful observance of causation in the universe. They're not ancient natural philosophy is not modern science. They do not have all of the information, and they don't have all the tools that we have available to us, but it's a lot more than people had just a few centuries before them. So they're more accurately using those to more accurately explain the cosmos than their predecessors did. So I'm going to suggest that the philosophical definition of Zeus is a newer, but it's not necessarily less accurate understanding of what it means to have a god or to be a god, or whatever a god or divine force might be. So, Christian theology, as we've seen in all kinds of lectures, borrowed an awful lot from Neoplatonism, from later antique philosophy. So, unlike Plotinus and Proclus, who are equating Zeus with the demiurge, with the kind of second source, the creator, Christians are like, no, actually, we see God, as we understand God, with the form of the good, the one, the source. So they are identifying God with that. So we're looking at, though, the same kind of Neoplatonic cosmology, just a little bit definition of it as it's reworked to encompass Christian ideas or Christian sacred story as opposed to ancient Greek sacred story. So, like the Neoplatonic Zeus, God in Christianity does not actually have a wife or a gender, despite the frequent convention that uses male pronouns and imagery of, for example, a father, Heavenly Father. So God actually transcends gender, and that is very clear in Christian theology and philosophy going all the way back to antiquity. It's not necessarily well known in pop popular Christianity by regular people in the pews who haven't read a lot of theology and who just read the Bible kind of straightforward and literally. But this is the understanding, from Christian thinkers. Likewise, these kind of pictures that we get, especially beginning really in modern times, the Renaissance, conventional portraits of God as a guy with a white beard and this kind of thing, these are owing a lot more to pictures of Zeus. So the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical ideas and imagery, and those kind of pictures are more in keeping with that. Zeus with a lot more clothes, maybe a little older, is where these kind of ideas come from. These shouldn't be taken literally as picturing God who is unpicturable. So what I want to suggest is that the Bible, even written at different times by different people with different ideas, at best is snapshots in an evolving idea of God. So despite where Christian thinkers have been in the Middle Ages and in modern times, in terms of thinking about God theologically as transcendent, that's always informed by portraits of God found throughout Christian scriptures in the New Testament as well, but also grounded in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And of course, these pictures from the Old Testament are much, much earlier and less developed than the later theological thinking. Likewise, while the Bible itself, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was edited, perhaps at the time of Ezra, as we were seeing when we were looking at that timeline, by monotheist reformers, it does include source texts that are older. And some of the source texts were written at a time when there was no monotheism. Yahweh was not understood as God with a capital G, but rather Yahweh was understood to be a God, maybe the most important God for the Israelite people, depending on the time we're thinking of, who is part of a pantheon of gods the same way that the Greek and Roman and Norse and other Egyptian and other gods are part of a pantheon of gods. There are traces of that old pantheon that remain in the Old Testament. So for example, these are showing themselves in the multiple ways that God is named in the biblical texts. So most people are probably very aware that in the Hebrew Bible, in addition to this name Yahweh that I keep saying, so which was translated into the King James Version as Jehovah, it's a name that in Judaism you're not supposed to say out loud, and so it's instead they have four letters that they put together, the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, and instead of saying it, then they'll say Lord when they get to that part, Adonai, or whatever the modern version of that is now. So often that is printed, even in English Bibles, and where it would have said Yahweh or Jehovah, it's actually printed the Lord. And so a lot of times when you read the Lord says this, what the actual underlying text is saying there is Yahweh. But in addition to all the places where in the Old Testament it will say either the Lord or underlying that Yahweh, God is also called God in the English translation, which is expressed in the Old Testament both using the name El, which originated as the name of a god, different god than Yahweh, and it also represents the generic word for God in ancient Semitic, in Hebrew, which is one of the reasons why the Semitic language, Arabic, we have Allah is the name of God, so there's the same related word. But it's especially, we especially have the form Elohim in the Hebrew Bible, which is taking the generic word for God and pluralizing it. And so, in fact, even though it's a monotheistic and it's referring to God singular, it is in fact saying gods plural. So in addition to these two main ways that God is named in the Old Testament, Yahweh and Elohim, there's also a number of additional epithets. So epithets is when you're adding an additional name to a particular hero or god or demigod or person, or a god in this case. So, for example, one of the names for God in the Old Testament is El Elyon, and that means El, the Most High. And of the other El epithets, there's plenty of these. There's just a handful of them. Are El Shaddai, El Almighty, El Roy, El Who Sees Me. And so you can already see here in terms of traces of an old pantheon, if you're El Most High or El the Almighty, this is God El, the Most High God, which is to say, it's a comparison between other gods in a pantheon who are not Most High. They're lesser high. So this is the Most High El. Similarly, one of the epithets for Yahweh is Yahweh Sabaoth, which means Yahweh of hosts. And so again, this is an image of the host of heaven. We're getting the idea that there's a pantheon, there's more than one God here in the heavens, in these earlier conceptions of what God is. The Bible also refers to the sons of God. So for example, we've had, it's especially prominent when we've done the different lectures on the books of Enoch, which are thinking about this very passage from Genesis chapter 6 an awful lot. There's the story of when the sons of Elohim, the sons of God, look upon the daughters of humans, and they see that they're beautiful, and so they say, let's go down, and they intermarry with them, and that causes the birth of the Nephilim, the giants, the heroes of old. So that's an example, again, of sons of God, sons of El, other gods in a pantheon who are in the process of getting reduced down to being angels and fallen angels in terms of the cosmological conception, but probably still at the time that this story is being told or thought of, more like little gods in a pantheon or lesser gods in a pantheon. In that same kind of way, Psalm 89, for example, compares the sons of God to Yahweh. Obviously, Yahweh is being compared favorably to them, but it's still a comparison that seems to be worthy of being made. So in the psalm we read, "Who in the skies compares to Yahweh?" So in other words, in the heavens, all of these different gods that exist in the heavens, who can compare to Yahweh? Likewise, who can be likened to Yahweh among the sons of God, the Bene Elim? So again, that's comparing the other sons of God to Yahweh. Yahweh's the better one, but it doesn't mean that there's not other gods, other sons of gods in the heavens. Deuteronomy 32 contains a pre-biblical poem. Scholars tend to label the Song of Moses, which refers to Elyon, God Most High, and how Elyon then divides the sons of Adam, divides humanity into tribes, into inheritances, and then gives them national gods. For example, giving Israel, Jacob is just the other name for Israel, to Yahweh. And so we read in that poem, when Elyon gave nations their land, when he divided the descendants of Adam, he set up borders for the tribes corresponding to the number of the sons of Israel. But Yahweh's people were his property. Jacob was his own possession. And so this seems to be, whereas it alternates in the poem between talking about Yahweh as an El, as a God, as our God, and so on. This seems to be an idea of Yahweh as a son of El. El divides the different descendants of humanity into tribes and gives the sons of Israel to Yahweh as the national God for Yahweh. So then Yahweh becomes the national God for Israel and Judah, and other gods, other sons of El, like Chemosh, becomes the national god for Moab, for example. So I want to look at kind of a partial West Semitic pantheon. This is by no means exhaustive, but just give us a little picture of some of these gods. So talked about El. So El is the heavens, kind of the supreme heavenly deity initially, but as opposed to being like Zeus, El is more like, so Zeus is more of an active storm god. It's going to be more along the lines of Baal Hadad, or more along the lines of Yahweh. Instead, Zeus overthrows his father, Kronos, who is Saturn. And Saturn is more like, and Saturn before him, Uranus, is more like the more removed heavens who are less active. So El is sort of that way, kind of pulling back into the kind of the more cosmic but remote divine heaven as almost just the heavens. El is married to Asherah, who we've been talking about, sometimes seen as the Queen of Heaven. There's more than one god that has that title, but is certainly the consort of El, sometimes called Elat, the goddess. Amongst these then, we've had, when we did our Baal lecture, of course, Baal is a title that means Lord, but it also, in the West Semitic sense, is often especially referring to Hadad, who is the Lord of Thunder, one of these very active sky gods, and is probably the main Baal that is being referenced in the Bible, one of the major figures in the Bible. Also in the Bible is the Leviathan, the Lotan, one of the monsters of chaos that Baal fights. We also have the kind of chaos, the god of the defiled sea, Yam, Mot, the god of death, Anat, who is a virgin, warrior goddess, Dagon, the god of crops, Athtar, god of the morning star, and then Shapsu, the goddess of the sun. So in the Middle Eastern pantheons, in the Greek pantheons, the sun is like Helios or Apollo, and same thing with the Egypt is Ra. So in other words, the sun is often with a male god, but Shepsu is the sun is female, a goddess, and Shemesh, who is sometimes the one that's mentioned in both of these are in the Bible maybe, but the Shemesh is in Hebrew a rare noun that could either be feminine or masculine. So again, the sun. And so sometimes it's just talking about people in the Bible worshiping the sun or the morning star, the constellations and so forth. These are the different gods, and they're not always mentioned by name. So amongst all these, we have Yahweh, who interestingly is a later addition to the pantheon. So he is not a god that exists kind of anciently and into antiquity, going back to Sumer and Akkad and Mesopotamia and Ugarit even. And so there's been a question, where does this god come from? So there's a long-standing hypothesis called the Canaanite hypothesis or the Midianite hypothesis, where it's understood that maybe Yahweh is a warrior god among the Bedouins from Sinai or Edom that becomes popularized, whose cult becomes popularized in Judah and Israel somehow. And certainly in the biblical stories, for example, Moses marries a woman from the tribes of Midian, Sephirah, and so that's one of the ideas. Another possibility is that Yahweh begins as an epithet of El. It's not known where this is necessarily coming from, and so then and then kind of becomes, sometimes when you have an epithet like Baal and Hadad, so Baal becomes almost the name for Hadad, that epithet, Lord, becomes the meaning, and then sometimes it can come reattached. So it's possible that Yahweh began as an epithet of El and then later merged back into El, but it's not entirely known. And nevertheless, this is a kind of a partial pantheon. Unlike like Greek mythology, which seems to, the more you kind of research it, and it's not all one thing, it's actually very contradictory, because different poets say that different people are the different heroes, or different gods are the children of different other gods. There's different origin stories, because there's no one authority. There was no one pope of ancient Greek paganism. Rather, there are all kinds of different poets and all kinds of different cults and shrines that are syncretizing and coming together. And so as a result of that, when I mentioned that Zeus and Leda, it's not even always clear which one of Zeus's children by Leda hatches from the egg. They also sometimes, his other children by Leda are Castor and Pollux. Usually one of them is divine and the other one isn't, but sometimes they're both divine. It depends on how the story is being told. Anyway, it tends to only get bigger and bigger. When I was in junior high and I was really obsessed with, I love Greek mythology and also genealogy, I tried to make like charts of it and tried to kind of make it a very expansive chart, and just even trying to chart like Zeus and all the different wives and or mistresses and all of the different children by Zeus is pretty much, that gets you pretty far into a book. It's not just all on one piece of paper. But by contrast to that, in sort of the West Semitic area, especially of Canaanites, the Israelites, there seems to have been a conscience contraction going on. So lots of the extraneous gods were falling out, and people were focusing their worship on just a handful of gods. And so, for example, El, the supreme heavenly deity, Asherah, the wife of El, the great mother goddess, are at the center of that. We also have Baal Hadad, the lord of thunder, one of whose characteristics is his fighting of the monsters of chaos, Lotan, this new god, the warrior from the south, Yahweh. And then there were other gods too. I'm not trying to say that there was no other gods, I'm just collectively calling these gods, even the goddesses, the sons of El. And so, but nevertheless, it's contracting in the prehistoric period, or at least pre-biblical period. As things get going, as we get into the monarchical period from the tribal period of the Israelites, when the northern kingdom of Israel gets going under King Omri and his dynasty, the Omride period, one of the things that seems to happen is Yahweh and El merge. So Yahweh effectively absorbs El. And this shouldn't surprise us because, again, like we've seen in the Bible, by the time we get down to the Bible, El is just essentially a synonym for Yahweh. Elohim and Yahweh are just other ways of saying the same thing. It's not, to say Jehovah and God is not talking about two different gods. It's just two different ways of talking about God, because El and Yahweh merge together. Specifically, it seems, because Omri and the other northern kings, the kings of this ancient kingdom of Israel, begin to promote Yahweh as Israel's national God. But even while they're doing that, that doesn't mean that they are saying there are no other gods. And indeed, they seem to have an understanding that even though El and Yahweh, that they're one God, that Yahweh is still married to his consort, Asherah. And there's a lot of places where we see the phrase even Yahweh's Asherah. So El's consort, Asherah, becomes the consort of Yahweh when the two merge. There are still other gods, but part of the pantheon begins this reduction in status, being grouped together as the sons of El, that's ultimately going to evolve into angels, when biblical Judaism gets going. So in the Bible, an exception to this reduction of the other gods is Baal, who is seen, biblically anyway, in the biblical texts, as a rival of Yahweh. And so we had a whole lecture on Baal and how frequently Baal figures in the biblical texts, and we had I even read the whole long story of the showdown that the prophet Elijah, who is a prophet of Yahweh, has against the priests of Baal, and actually there's also priests of Asherah who are among Elijah's enemies, and it's a wonderful takedown, a great narrative. So Baal, in the Bible anyway, is remembered as a rival of Yahweh. And then as the Bible evolves, what ends up happening is Yahweh doesn't become Baal. Baal doesn't become a synonym for Yahweh. Baal is still an enemy. I'm going to have to get a drink of water here. So Baal is still an enemy, but Yahweh assumes Baal's roles. So for example, we saw all the while in the Baal cycle that Baal is the one that fights Lotan, the monster of chaos, but in the Bible, as we've read several times, it's Yahweh who fights against the Leviathan. He's taken on those roles of Baal because Baal is not a son of El. Baal is not an angel. Baal is simply an idol. And so this is the understanding by the time we're getting to the Bible. Nevertheless, for a whole long time, Yahweh still probably has a consort, Asherah, because prior to the very end of the Second Temple period, the First Temple period, when we have the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, shrines that we have archaeological evidence for seem to have shrines of Israelite religion seem to have at least two spots for a cult object, and the Bible also frequently talks about these additional Asherah poles, these symbols of additional gods. And even way down into the Second Temple period, cut off from Judah, there are a whole group of exiled Israelites, a whole group of exiled Jews in Egypt, in a place called Elephantine, where they have their own temple. These have been mercenaries who are troops fighting in the army of Pharaoh, defending the border, the southern border. And in their temple worships more than one god, because they haven't had this change of the religion down to a single focus ultimately to monotheism. So finally, as the reformers, like I say, under Hezekiah and Josiah in Judah, they move from the idea of henotheism, which is simply promoting a national god. So we're saying, yes, Yahweh is the God of Israel, but that doesn't mean that women can't keep on worshiping Asherah, or other people can't also worship other gods alongside Yahweh. From henotheism to monolatry, which is to say, okay, now we're forbidding worship of other gods. You aren't allowed to worship Asherah, but we're not saying Asherah or Baal doesn't exist. So as that's happening, Asherah's roles are absorbed by Yahweh. And there are passages in the Bible, for example, that talk about Yahweh providing, fertility over, over breasts and womb in the same kind of way that would have been a statement that would have been ascribed to Asherah, but now it gets absorbed by Yahweh. So at this point, at the end of the First Temple period, the Asherah poles, the Asherim, that's when, as we kind of have in the biblical accounts that I've already read, the reformers rip them down, burn them, and scatter the ashes in the Kidron Valley over the graves of everybody. So when we're looking at the Bible, as I was kind of trying to indicate with, what if everything that we knew about the ancient Greek gods, we only knew through the reformers? We only knew it through Plato and Plotinus and Proclus, these guys who have wanted to change how we understand what Zeus is. So that's what we have with the Bible. So the Bible, as told by these reformers, is the story from creation all the way to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586. So that's the First Temple period and pre-history. So when we are telling that, we're starting, the way the Bible's told, with a monotheistic foundation. One God is talking to Adam and Moses and Abraham. And what happens then increasingly, like in the period of the judges and the kings, the people turn away from God and they become polytheists, they become pagans, and that rebellion increases. And according to the Deuteronomists, the people who are composing the Deuteronomic histories in the Bible, their belief is that that is what led to the destruction of Jerusalem. And so when they, the Bible writers, the Bible editors, are talking about the different kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, the good kings are the ones that destroy all the idols, that tear down the Asherah poles and so forth, that remember Yahweh. The bad kings are the ones that say, okay, let's set up a Asherah pole, let's get back out the Baal statues and all that kind of thing. So even though that's the way the Bible's told, what actually is occurring is that the reform is happening and emerging kind of in the course of the end of the First Temple period. So at the beginning, the ancient Israelites more or less are the same as all of their neighbors. They are pagans, they are polytheists, just like the Canaanites. Henotheism is introduced as a centralizing reform, and it's introduced, Yahwism, a kind of Yahwism, is introduced in the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and then when it's destroyed, it continues to be the focus in the kingdom of Judah for the entire period, and it's only at the very end when the Davidic kings, Hezekiah, Josiah, and their Zadokite priests and their Yahwist prophets, they're the reformers who are trying to fight the tradition of polytheism, which is what everyone has been, introducing henotheism, monolatry, and ultimately that emerges monotheism from that. So literally that's upside down. So read literally, the Bible presents a pyramid that is upside down to actual ancient Israelite history. And like I say, this is because the texts are written or edited by henotheists and later monotheist reformers. And they, of course, are seeking to portray their own ideas as ancient, and they may well have thought that they were the actual ancient ideas. Whereas what were actually the truly ancient practices, the practices of the polytheists, are presented incorrectly as recent innovations that are introduced by foreigners, especially by foreign women, princesses that the different kings marry and who turn Israel astray. This is a pretty normal thing in religion. Antiquity is almost always viewed as important to religious people. And so when you have an innovation, it's often portrayed as a reform. In other words, we're going, or even a restoration of what went of an ancient practice that has been, we've forgotten, has been declined, in decline. Anyway, even though that's a bias, I don't actually think that that bias should hold. Actually, we are learning more and more and more throughout all of history. We have better ideas, and so in fact, what happened, where the ideas from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago aren't always the best ideas. In fact, we need to sometimes update those and have new conceptions. But this is the bias. So if we just ground ourselves once more, just in that time frame, I've mentioned these different periods several times, but again, I just want to bring this out. So we're talking about the kingdom of Israel, which is the more important kingdom in the beginning. And then after its destruction, that's when we have the rise of the kingdom of Judah. The very beginning of Yahwism, of this centralizing, this idea of Yahweh as the national God of Israel, begins in the kingdom of Israel under Omri and his dynasty, his son Ahab. And then those reformers who eliminate the other gods or cut down the Asherah poles and so on, Hezekiah and not Manasseh, but Hezekiah and Josiah, those are at the end, and in between them, Manasseh actually reverts everything back to traditional practices. Okay. The bulk of biblical texts, as we've seen, the date to the First Temple period, they're composed after the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom, to Samaria. Israelite authors portrayed their patrons, the kings of Judah. So these are after that fall, the exiles go down. Some of the exiles are taken away to Assyria and in the last 10 tribes. Others come to Judah, which has a flowering. The kings of Judah, which are a client kingdom of Assyria, but still existing, now have their flowering, and they patronize both local authors and local priests and also exiled Israelite authors. And so the ones that had come from Israel, we speculate, portray their patrons, the kings of Judah, as the heirs of Israel's legacy. And this is why they create what is almost certainly the myth that the eponymous ancestor of the kings of Judah, the kings of Jerusalem, whose house is called the house of David, they assume that they have an ancestor that's named David, and then David is then said to be the ruler of a united monarchy from which Israel had rebelled. And so if we go back to that time frame, so this is all happening after 720 here, the fall of Israel, in this later time period when the texts are actually being written in the kingdom of Judah, and they're looking back to this area that I'm marking in gray, the United Monarchy period, which is actually a myth, not related to actual history. So just to take a picture of this, I have this little picture of Judah at the time when the northern kingdom, Samaria, has been incorporated as a province of the Assyrian Empire. I just want to show how big the Assyrian Empire is in relationship to Judah, which is, despite its literary flowering at this time period, is obviously a very tiny client state, remote part of the Assyrian Empire. Nevertheless, being part of the imperial network allows it to have a lot of commercial success, and this is one of the reasons why the kings are able to kind of patronize a little literary renaissance that starts biblical text writing. So, prior to the fall of the northern kingdom, and we're just talking about like this myth of the Davidic monarchy or the myth of the united monarchy, Israel wasn't known as internationally as the land of David. It's known as the land of the people of Omri. So, for example, in this obelisk from Assyria from the 9th century BC, this is showing, like the Assyrian emperors like to show, people in different kingdoms that are giving tribute. And in this case, we have King Jehu from the land of the people of Omri, bowing to the Assyrian emperor Shalmaneser III. And so Israel here isn't even called Israel, it's called the house of Omri, the land of the people of Omri, because of how important Omri has been in the international conception of who this people are. Similarly, a stele, a stone here erected by King Mesha of Moab around the year 800 BCE. It talks about Chemosh, the national god of the Moabites, in a very interestingly similar way to the way Yahweh is portrayed in the Bible. So Chemosh is essentially viewed as the most important god of the Moabites, who chastises the Moabites when they turn away from him. It's almost the same kind of thing that the Bible talks about for Judah and Israel, about Yahweh and turning away from Yahweh. So the text reads in part, Omri, king of Israel, oppressed Moab for many days. Why? Because Chemosh, our god, the Moab god, was angry with his land, was angry with the Moabites. And so because he's angry with the Moabites, they bring in these foreigners, the Israelites, to come and oppress Moab. It's the same kind of thing that happens in the book of Judges, where when people forget Yahweh, Yahweh causes the Philistines to come in and take over the tribes of Israel. But again, the extra-biblical archaeology here is really focusing especially on Omri and the northern kingdom prior to the fall of Israel. So archaeology and the extra-biblical historical record, I think, indicate that the northern kingdom rose under Omri and his dynasty and maybe his predecessors. And while that's happening, Jerusalem remains a hill town, so there is really no chance that it was the center of an Iron Age large kingdom that was including Israel at any time. And Judah itself was very underpopulated relatively, so it was a backwater while Israel was still there. When it gets destroyed, that's when it has its flowering. So although the Bible portrays Omri and his dynasty, the Omrides, as enemies of Yahweh, actually, it does seem to be that they may have been among the first to promote Yahwism. So that seems a little counterintuitive. It seems against the narrative again. So the suggestion that Yahwism, this henotheist focus on Yahweh as the God of Israel, that begins in the northern kingdom, it's certainly contrary to the biblical portraits. So Omri is pretty quickly dismissed in the book of Kings. In 1 Kings 16, we read, Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. So he is a bad king. He followed completely the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, so that they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. So definitely the biblical portrayal is that Omri, following in the footsteps of Jeroboam, who is, the Bible illustrates as narrates as the founder of the northern kingdom. Both of them are focusing on idolatry, on polytheism, on paganism, according to the Bible. Omri's son and successor, Ahab, so King Ahab, we talked about him a lot in our lecture on Baal. It's this Ahab who marries Jezebel from Sidon, one of the Phoenician city-states, and together with her promotes the cult of Baal and also of Asherah. And so they, and all the priests of Baal, have their contest against Elijah. And so as a result of that, Ahab is really promoted or portrayed as anything but a Yahwist in the Bible. And indeed, in the book of Kings, 1 Kings 16, we read, Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So he is a bad king, according to the biblical portrait. Nevertheless, despite this portrayal, the Omride name, so those names, the other people in this dynasty, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Athaliah, so these guys have theophoric Yahweh names. So we've talked about these before when you have names that end in Aya, these are, Yahweh names, and also Yeho, these have the Yah in the front of them, so Jehoshaphat and all those kind of names. So So it would be a little strange for this dynasty that is supposedly just Baal happy to be naming their kids with Yahweh names, which is what we see. In the same way that we actually see when we were doing these theophoric names, that there are important judges and also kings like Saul's son that have Baal names in the Bible, which seems very odd again. So Gideon, who's one of the heroes of the book of Judges, he also has a Baal name. And so you might expect that, this northern dynasty, that all of the people like Ahab and Omri and all of their relatives would have names like Jezebel and Hannibal, names that have Baal in them, and instead they're having Yahweh names. And that is actually also true when at archaeological sites in the northern kingdom. So when Iron Age archaeology is done and you get pottery, and the pottery has different people's names on it. So these are like little fragments of pottery, ostraca, that have where names are found. The majority of names that are theophoric, in other words, that have a god's name in them from the area in the royal centers for the northern kingdom, actually again have Yahweh names. And so it does seem that there is a major focus, at least by the elite, on Yahwism, despite what the biblical narrative has to say. There's an interesting story as told in the Bible in terms of the northern kingdom about golden calves, which are set up at shrines at Bethel and Dan. And so so while the Bible, which again is written later than the time period, this is supposedly set up at the very beginning of the northern kingdom, but of course the text is written past the end of it, towards the end of the southern kingdom. And so it's anachronistically presenting these as a response to the commandment to centralize worship at Jerusalem, something that only exists really at the end of the First Temple period. So it's presented as a response to this mythical centralized worship under David and Solomon. Nevertheless, the biblical account of these shrines is really interesting. So Jeroboam, the king of the north, fortified Shechem, one of the northern capitals, in the hill country of Ephraim, the central tribe of Israel, the northern kingdom, and lived there. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If all the people here in the north go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, the Davidic king down in Judah. They will kill me and they will return to Jeroboam. So essentially, this is a time period where the two kingdoms are separated. Again, there's the pretense that they had all been unified under a Davidic house before, and that the practice had been to sacrifice down, but that's just the setup. What actually happens then is the king says, after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. He has the calves, these 2 golden calves. So one he set up in Bethel and the other at Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. So he's essentially making rival shrines, which just tells us that the northern kingdom had its own shrines for worshiping. And again, these are the gods of Israel, but again, gods plural here, but there's also an interesting thing about plural when we're using God in the biblical text. Because in fact, this quotation that Jeroboam has here, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt, In making this announcement about his calves, Jeroboam is actually echoing the words that Aaron says at Sinai, at least in the mythic tale in Exodus. So after Aaron, Moses' brother, is convinced by the people to make a golden calf idol, he announces, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt," even though he only makes one calf idol. And we still say, "Here are your gods." So this is definitely very clearly meant to echo each other. And presumably, the story about Aaron actually is actually the echo of a practice in the northern kingdom, probably relating to these shrines where there is a calf. So a golden calf or a young little bull, this is a symbol of Baal, but we'll see how this could be your gods or Israel's gods as we look forward at what's going on here. So I got a map here of the two. I guess I don't. But anyway, if we go back to this map, just in terms of where Bethel and Dan are, Dan is at the very top. You can't see it in the text here, but right between where it says Phoenicia and Aram. So it's at the very tip of the north of the Israel kingdom. And at the very bottom, right next to Jerusalem of the Israel kingdom, so Jerusalem's at the northern tip of Judah, that's where Bethel is. And the idea of these calves are, in the same way that in the Ark of the Covenant, where you have the two cherubim, which are on top of the ark in the temple in Jerusalem, Yahweh is sitting on top of that, and Yahweh is therefore over top of the whole kingdom, or overseeing the kingdom at the shrine of the temple in Jerusalem. But by making one calf on either side for God to be on top of at Bethel and Dan, what the king of Israel is doing is saying God is not just standing over top of one temple in Jerusalem or any one temple in Samaria or Shechem, but rather God is standing across astride all of Israel. Yahweh, or whoever the God is here, the God, these are your gods who brought you out of Egypt, O Israel. The God of Israel here is protecting the entire realm. Okay, so sorry, I thought I had a map there. Okay, biblical patronage, the patronage of biblical authors, like I say, correspond with the end of the kingdom of Judah, and especially, for example, the reign of King Josiah, who is at the end of the 7th century BCE. So Josiah, who is one of these reformers who is destroying the Asherah poles and so forth, his acts include conquering, which hadn't been part of Judah before, but now it had been part of the northern kingdom, which has fallen to the Assyrians. He goes to that nearby shrine, Bethel. This is a typo here in the slide where it says Bethelland. It's supposed to say Bethel and. So he goes and conquers Bethel, and he destroys then the Israelite shrine that was there. He doesn't go to the one that's Dan, that's way too far away into Assyria. He just goes to this very closely over the border and attacks Bethel. So the book of Kings, again, it's written at the time of Josiah, though it includes narrative that dates all the way back to Jeroboam. It has an unnamed prophet at the time of Jeroboam predict that Josiah would eventually do this very thing. So it says, by the word of the Lord, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel, as Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make an offering. By the word of the Lord, he, this unnamed prophet, cried out against the altar, "Altar, altar, this is what the Lord says, a son named Josiah will be born, hundreds of years from now, to the house of David. On you he will make a sacrifice, the priests of the high places, on you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you." So this is sort of an uncanny level of prediction where they're predicting actually someone by name, which almost never happens. And it's a big telltale sign that this is a literary prediction that is being written in King Josiah's time by somebody who knows that Josiah already did it and is simply inserting it into the past, putting it in the voice of a prophet who isn't even named. So this prophecy is fulfilled in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 23. So among all of the reforms that happen under Josiah, the King Josiah, orders Hilkiah the high priest, the priests next in rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts, so all of the other gods besides Baal and Asherah. Josiah burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley, and he took the ashes to Bethel, this place of that shrine with the golden calf. He did away with the idolatrous priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places in the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem. There's not going to be any of these shrines anymore. Everything is going to be centralized. All worship will be centralized to Jerusalem. All of the previous worship of Israelites, where they are burning incenses to Baal, to the sun, the moon, the constellations, all the starry hosts, that is forbidden. And then even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place to the ground and ground it to powder and burned the ashes of the Asherah pole also. So all of the previous polytheist worship, all of the understanding of the Pantheon here, all the way down to the very end of the kingdom of Judah is ongoing, and Josiah is ending it, including fulfilling that prediction that people made after he did it, that he was going to destroy this shrine and altar at Bethel, which means house of God, so the house of the Lord, house of Yahweh, or of El, not the Lord, house of God. So we had talked about how for Judahite reformers like Josiah, Baal is seen as a rival to Yahweh, and so Baal is rejected. He is not to be worshipped. He is shown in a contest with the prophets of Yahweh, and he's shown ultimately just to be an idol. However, the Yahwism that occurred in the northern kingdom, when these kings are building these shrines of God, shrine at Bethel, and talking about the God of Israel, or the gods of Israel, and they're using Baal's imagery of the golden little bull and so forth, that probably understood a Yahwism that doesn't see Baal as a rival, but rather saw Baal as absorbed into Yahweh, the same way that El was absorbed into Yahweh. So once again, Yahweh is the one that's doing things that Baal does, like fighting Leviathan, but he also can just have the title Baal, which means Lord, the same way he has the title El, which means God. El's the name of a different God than Yahweh. But now they're merged together, and that fits nicely in the Bible, presumably for all of these northern kings for the Omri dynasty. Calling Yahweh Baal, calling him Lord, would not have been seen as anything wrong. So Baal is not a rival. He simply is God. He simply is Yahweh. And because it's not yet monotheism, this is an earlier idea with a reduced pantheon, but still a pantheon, Asherah will have been the consort then of God, Yahweh, El Baal. So the question we posed in this lecture's subtitle when we were talking about Asherah in general is, did God have a wife? And I think that when we get to the answer to this, the answer is actually yes, and no. So at different points in the story, Yahweh certainly is understood to have a wife, yes, and that wife actually is Asherah, because at a certain point Yahweh merges with El, who is the consort of Asherah. But the other answer is also no, because when Yahweh had a wife, Yahweh was a God theologically with a little g, but not God yet. And so in that sense, the answer is no. And in my opinion, indeed, we can just as accurately say that God, now that we are looking at our perspective of God with a capital G theologically, we might just as accurately say that God had a husband, which is to say that God had a husband who was named El or who was named Yahweh, since Asherah has also fully merged into God. So Asherah is one of the conceptual precursors of God, the same way that El and Yahweh, and to some extent Baal, but not as much, and have all kind of come together into the modern conception, or even later antique and medieval conception of God. And so God is ultimately taken on all of these earlier conceptions, and none of the ancient Israelites had the modern conception of God or this transcendent understanding of God, because they were much more closely related to an ancient polytheist understanding of God. But when we have in the priestly creation story, the beginning of Genesis, God saying, let us make humankind in our own image, and ultimately humans are made male and female in the image of God. This is in part because God transcends things like gender. God isn't simply an old man with a white beard or something like that. God is more than that. So that is my take on Asherah and the question, did God have a wife? And so I will go ahead and get a drink of water as Mike finds your questions for me. Comments. So I want to thank people for their support to start. I certainly want to thank Rowan Wagner, Michael Rogers, JM, Daryl Scott, Kelly Higgins, Philosophy. Philosophy was just on Sunday for the first time. Welcome back. Carney Defoe and Johnson. I really appreciate that. This is, like I said at the beginning, this allows us to continue to prioritize these, and I really enjoy it because this is among my most favorite things that I do every week. And so it's a little bit of work to do all the reading and research and make all the slides and to stand up for 2 hours or so once a week. But I enjoy doing it and I appreciate your support. We also have had live viewers from all around the world. And so you guys have chimed in from places as far afield as here in Canada, the US, the UK, Brazil, Argentina, Denmark, Japan, Australia, France, the Philippines, Slovakia. Thank you all for all being with us. I appreciate the global audience that we're attracting. Chile, I missed Chile. Here's some questions. Julie Bezuski asks, since Asherah is associated with trees, could that symbolism be related to the tree of life? Yeah, so it's possible. So there's a bunch of different symbolism that can happen. And so in the same very way, there's the very same way that I like to stay close to the sources, and so when it's saying Queen of Heaven, and there's a lot of different possibilities for Queen of Heaven, and we don't have an explicit statement, you have to make a little bit of a leap. In this case, like the tree of life, and I'm thinking you're probably talking about the Eden story. There's other connections that people have made, though, not only with the tree, but also, for example, with Eve. And so there is another Semitic goddess that has a name similar to Eve, which is syncretized or an epithet of Asherah, and so there's also that association. And of course, there's association with goddesses and snakes. And so a lot of rich potential imagery in the Eden story, but like you say, the tree is also one of the potential connections. And so maybe that's why Eve is associated with it too. Rain Weber says, Does El have a wife mean that they each had parents? Zeus and Hera were the children of Kronos. If not, did El create his wife? Are these questions why early Judaism suppressed Asherah cults? I don't. So I think that what ends up happening is it's not El that creates his wife. If anything, it would be the other way around, I think. Usually, so when we're doing like when you're getting back in the Greek myths, which take it telescopes it a couple generations back, right? So when we get all the way back to Gaia and Uranus, Oranos, we're getting like the primordial earth and primordial sky, right? And so it's actually the earth that gives birth to the sky. And so it's usually like the earth that is created first out of chaos. And so I think that Asherah's epithets, which are included like creator and mother of all and things like that. So it would maybe be that Asherah, I don't know that we have an explicit myth about this, but it may not be, we might by association think that Asherah maybe is giving birth to the sky as opposed to the other way around. I don't know that we have as many generations. Again, it's a more contracted pantheon, and we have less myths anyway because so few of the texts have survived comparatively to what we have for ancient Greece. So that would be my speculation on that. Corey T says, so did the followers of Asherah serve the poor and those of Yahweh didn't like that? I wouldn't say that necessarily. I think that there would have been common people who are interested in both. Yahwism is definitely a royal institution in the sense that it is patronized by the kings. So I've speculated here, and I think there's good evidence that the Yahwist cult is promoted by the Omrids, who are the kings of the north, who are suggesting that this is going to be our national god who is defending our nation Israel in the same way like we saw with Moab, the Moabites. The king there is promoting Chemosh as the national god of the Moabites. And then later, definitely under the Davidic kings, Yahweh is promoted as the national god. And so it is a royal patronage. And it goes both ways because the prophets and God are giving promises to the Davidic house that they're never going to be out of power. And then later that there'll be new Davidic monarchs that will arise in the future. So that patronage goes both ways. But that doesn't mean that it's not a popular, means I think that Yahwism is a little more top-down from what our evidence is. We have so much less evidence of it being common. What I would say is that because we have all of these little figurines of Asherah is that is a popular thing that is maybe bottom up. Although we have in the biblical account, again, we saw how it's like royal queen mothers and princesses and queens are also devotees of Asherah, and that there's a whole precinct in the temple devoted to Asherah, and the women that are producing the religious garments for the cult figure and that kind of thing. So it is also patronized royally. So I wouldn't say that the one is serving the poor and the others aren't. The ideas of serving the poor is not the central focus ever of paganism and polytheism. It is actually more of a focus of the later world religion reformers. And so it's ultimately the Yahwist prophets like Isaiah that are saying all of these rituals that you guys are doing for Yahweh or for anybody else, those don't really have any meaning if you're letting the poor suffer, if you're letting the widows go hungry and so on. So I'd say it's actually more likely ultimately the reformers who are trying to add an ethical component to the religion as opposed to early paganism, which is mostly about ritual, making sure the universe continues to operate, ritual preventing, using superstition to prevent bad things, bad luck from happening to you and that kind of thing. Andre B. Moret asks, can John comment why he thinks that they had to hide Asherah in the King James, but not so much in the NIV? what changed historically. So I'm not sure that the King James scholars are deliberately hiding that. So the Septuagint, which is already an ancient translation, is already using the Greek word for grove in order to, in those cases. And so they're getting to a word that they don't have any, they don't know what it means, Asherah, and so it is, it's obviously, we know that there's a goddess there, but they think they're taking from this, the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Septuagint. They're seeing the word grove. They don't know what the word Asherah means, and then they translate it as grove, into English. In terms of the NIV, this is just, we have modern scholars. So I use the NIV because the NIV, in this case, I usually use the New Revised Standard Version, but the NIV made it much more clear that we're talking about Asherah poles. The word here is Asherah. The New Revised Standard Version says wooden idol, and I felt like that kind of is obscuring it. So I don't know. People, there's a historical judgment that is sometimes being made when the translations happen, and that's why I wanted to kind of make it clear that the word here is Asherah, which is the name of the goddess. It also could be a word, and the word could mean grove. More likely it means pole, but it doesn't probably just mean pole. It probably means pole that you use to worship the goddess. and so that's why I think that probably the best translation is Asherah pole, or Asherah idol. JB asks, if Asherah and possibly other gods are still being worshipped at the end of the first temple period, why do scholars say that Judaism is a 3,000-year-old religion? Well, so yeah, it depends on when you're saying that the religion evolves and, far enough to be into its present form to be recognizable. There's a great case to be made that modern Judaism is all descended from rabbinic Judaism, which really, gets codified in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries and so on. So it is, in other words, it's in some senses, a little newer than some of the formulations of Christianity, which is an off-break from Second Temple Judaism, the same way that rabbinic Judaism is an offshoot of Second Temple Judaism. So why do they say it's a 3,000-year-old religion? Well, there are identifiable people and roots of Second Temple Judaism in First Temple Judaism, even though First Temple Judaism is largely indistinguishable, I would say, from all of the contemporary paganism that's all around it, and it only is a different religion in retrospect. But that is going to be true for Hinduism. So all religions evolve, but Hinduism with all of its gods, and everything, that goes back to it's become a world religion because of all of its association with all of the world religions of India, especially. So Sikhism, Buddhism, all of the different, then later the ones that have come in after that, Christianity and Islam, have caused, as a reaction and also as adopting kind of universal ideas, Hinduism has become a world religion that has kind of a defining conception to it, but it would have originally began as a bunch of different polytheistic, different religions that would be different in each different little region. And that would have also been true for the beginnings, the first temple period Judaism. So, how long does anything last? So, it's a matter, I had kind of this kind of periodization argument lecture. I gave a lecture, did the Roman Empire actually not fall at all? Does it still exist in some way, some meaningful way? Well, maybe it does. It depends on how you're counting. What you're counting is the beginning and the end of anything. So Videos for Stuff asks, is it fair to view the development of a Western God concept as a contest between those who want to see God as a virile man and those who want to see him above something like sex? Well, no, but so here's the thing. You even use the word him above. So I would think that that primarily the focus has been understanding the Creator as something that totally transcends, as a being that transcends all of our human limitations, and then we picture that being in all kinds of things, ways as a loving father, as a loving parent, and those kind of ways, or as love itself. And so those are conceptual ways that are done. And then, yes, more modernly, especially with evangelicalism, people who, when you're reading the Bible without knowing its context, its background, without having a theological primer behind it, and just taking it on its face, and you're just reading he pronouns and thinking it's like this is a virile man acting, I'd say that's a modern misreading. I wouldn't say that that's the whole thing that's happened. It's certainly something that happens in a subset of Christianity today. It's also other Abrahamic religions, so Islam today too. Philosophy asks, I know this isn't directly related to the lecture, but does Community of Christ believe in a goddess or that God has a wife? So again, our belief is that God transcends gender. And so although some people talk about God as Heavenly Father, and that's a title that is used, and even Jesus in the Bible says, "Our Father who art in heaven," you can also picture God as Heavenly Mother. And so in terms of goddess or our Mother in heaven, this is not a separate wife of God. This is God. God is also the Creator, the womb of creation, not simply male imagery. God encompasses the divine feminine and the divine masculine and the entire spectrum of identity between that. In the same way that God creates the darkness and the light and all the spectrum in between, separates the waters from the land, and again the beach, everything that is in between, gender as well, and God encompasses and transcends all. So that would be what I would say where we're at. Roger Parker asks, is Asherah related to Shekinah? And so this is from the Kabbalah, and I am not an expert in Kabbalah. I'll just have to say I appreciate Jewish mysticism, and so I don't know a lot about Kabbalah, and so I'm just going to have to say I don't know the details, Roger. Corey T asks, how is it okay for Yahweh to divorce Asherah when he also considers it a mortal issue for humans to divorce, or a moral issue? So Yahweh didn't divorce Asherah. Yahweh absorbed Asherah, and so God encompasses both Yahweh and Asherah, as we kind of say, I think, in this lecture, in terms of the historical development. In terms of humans and divorce, so this is coming out of Jesus' teachings. So the historical Jesus, most certainly, because we have multiple attestation on this. One of his kind of teachings is forbidding divorce, and this, I would say, is probably because of how divorce was being practiced at the time, and so there was maybe perhaps easy divorce that was allowing men in his community in rural Galilee to cease to support their wives and to have wives live essentially then functionally as widows with children and not able to support them, and so therefore women and children being subjected to total poverty as a result of that. And so he's probably speaking out against a contemporary practice, but this is a reason why, again, Christianity is not about letter of the law kind of stuff, and it shouldn't be. Jesus is constantly also teaching that principles are what matter and spirit of is what matters. He's rejecting legalistic interpretation of Jewish law. And so the fact that Christians in turn then go and start taking Jesus literally and making his statements into legalisms and causing all kinds of human misery by essentially taking something that might have been appropriate in his context in first century CE Galilee and then applying it in the 21st century when the issues that we have around marriage and divorce are so very different. I think that that's missing the point of Christianity. So I'm going to give Yahweh a pass on that one, but I am going to criticize Christians for following teachings like that with excessive legalism and rigidity, which causes some misery. Grenady Korotki says, how did they define what goodness is God and what goodness is goddess? So when there are, I'm presuming you're talking essentially, you're capitalizing God and goddess in this, but when there is God and goddess, then this is a time period when we shouldn't be capitalizing those because we're talking about polytheism. So when you're talking about goddess with a capital G, goddess equals God with a capital G. They're all the same. And so then in that case, goodness is both goddess and God, since God is one, and God is one with goodness. But when you're talking back in polytheistic times, in paganism, when we have goddesses and gods, they're not always associated with goodness, as we saw with Zeus. Zeus is doing all kinds of unethical things. So the philosophers are actually rejecting these previous understandings, these chaotic senses of gods and goddesses in polytheist pagan religions as being not related to goodness. And so the way the philosophers took care of this question about how to assign goodness is they assign goodness as essentially being one, and that therefore defining the divine as one, and therefore encompassing both female and male divine. So Austin Lewis says, is the plural Elohim used to avoid gendering God as male or female? I don't think so, because, I'm not, I can do Latin, I can't tell you Hebrew, unfortunately. I wish I had spent my undergrad years studying Hebrew, so I could tell you these things for sure, but usually I'm sure Elohim is probably I'm sure Elohim is actually masculine plural. So declined languages have both, but I don't know for sure, but anyway, I presume that it doesn't actually save us on this gender question. But what, and also the problem with that would be, again, it's an old practice. So this is already going back to the First Temple period, use of this sort of, whatever we want to say, the royal we or the divine plural for God. Exactly why that is the case, we can't really say. It's speculative, but we know it's an old practice. But unfortunately, it's not a practice that is fixing our gender problem. So as we've kind of talked about in a lot of these questions, there is a default gender, that we use in so many languages where we're saying he as a default. And we've had to spend my entire lifetime in English, getting rid of words like, stewardess and manhole cover and all of those different words in order to try to create a gender parity when we've always had societies that are inherently sexist. And so all I want to say with this theology is there's been a theological understanding in Christendom and other religions that God transcends gender and thus encompasses both female and the male, but that doesn't occur very often in Christianity in the pictures, and so Christianity does have and continues to have a lingering problem of having not emphasized the divine feminine. This is countered a little bit in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, which emphasizes a lot Mary and the cult of Mary, but I think unfortunately that has a problem of, Mary is clearly subordinate to God. Mary is not God, and so I still think that that's now in the present age not the solution, and the solution really has to be, if there's going to be a 21st century relevance in Christianity, that we have to understand God as Heavenly Mother just as much as we understand God as Heavenly Father. There are a lot of questions. This is a very active question and answer, which I really appreciate. There's still 16 questions to go, I am told. So Ricky Palacios asks, where or when does the Tetragrammaton YHWH come in, and what is it? So the Tetragrammaton, like you say, is the 4 letters, and we call those by the Roman versions of that. There's the 4 letters in both Hebrew and then also later Greek in the Septuagint. But the Hebrew ones, which are where it comes in originally, as you probably know, Hebrew is, what I think is called an abjad, right? So it's not an alphabet. It's just consonants. So the original Hebrew is only written in the consonants, and so all the vowels aren't there. And so YHWH is the consonants in Yahweh, right, without the vowels. And so the vowels are our scholars' best attempt to figure out what the vowels would have been. And so where does it come from? It comes from, that's how you would write the word, because all the words would have not had vowels. And so that would be the name of God. And pretty much if you're reading the Bible, the Old Testament, anywhere where it says the Lord, the Hebrew would say YHWH in Hebrew. And so that's the Tetragrammaton. That's where it comes from. Tetragrammaton is Greek for 4-letter word, Tetragrammaton, tetragrammaton word. So 4 letters. And so that's where it comes from. That's what it is. It becomes important. So I say Yahweh because I'm Christian. In Judaism, it becomes a sin to say the word God. You're not only to picture God, you're also not to make images, not to make pictures. You're also not to say the word. And so they have a substitute word, Lord, that is said, and that's why it's printed in Bibles often, the Lord, instead of Yahweh. But it's sometimes printed as Jehovah and the King James Version, or modern times Yahweh. So philosophy asks, so the one God established all the gods of the nations. So the idea of that, you're kind of going back to the Song of Moses, and the fragment of that we have where Elyon, God Most High, is establishing, he's dividing up humanity into national gods, and he gives the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob he gives to Yahweh as his portion. So this is coming from this conception of this time period when Israel and its neighbors like Moab are saying, yeah, we're into this whole national God thing. We want to have our one big national God as our defender, as our main patron. It's like having, a patron saint, or it's like having a flag, and it's like having, your state bird. In other words, you want to have a symbol of your nation, but in this case, our God is our protector. We know there's a bunch of different gods. And so once that became a popular idea, this poem is reflecting that idea. And the idea of it is there's the Most High. It's not the one God. It's Most High. In other words, it's the sky. This more remote father of the gods, again, like Kronos or Uranus, who's giving, who's not to the point of the more active, closer to you storm gods like Baal Hadad or Zeus, or Yahweh, those are the gods that are closer by. The sky is dividing, El-Eon is dividing the people up into national gods, and that's why the Moabite national god is Chemosh, and Israel's national god is Yahweh. So, Rain Weber asks, modern Judaism isn't proselytizing on the whole, saying Gentiles have no need to follow their God's laws on diet and dress. Is this an echo of Yahweh being a national God of the Jews? So it could be, and it partially is. There is a major development of Second Temple Judaism, where there's a competing ideas of this. So on the one hand, in Second Temple Judaism, there are a bunch of Jewish thinkers and writers that go all the way back. So this includes the author of the book of Ruth, who is seeing Ruth, who's a Moabitess, as also being, she can have God, the God of Israel, be her God, even though Israelite Deuteronomic law says she's not welcome in the kingdom, or I'm sorry, in the congregation. Two, Jews like Paul, who is absolutely convinced that that God, to be the universal God, he means he's the God of everybody. That God is the universal God, and that both views are found biblically. And so, but the view of the narrowing view that you cannot, that God is the God of Israel, and that we need to not have people married-ins and half-breeds and so on coming into the congregation. That's also there, and that's certainly enforced by Ezra, who might have been the compiler of the Torah itself. And so that's a part of it and an echo of it. However, in terms of modern Judaism not proselytizing, it's also probably related to not having been a national or a state religion for so long. And so when a religion has to live under a different world religion, so once it's like once you're in the world, in a kingdom that is Muslim or a kingdom that's Christian, usually the majority religion doesn't let you convert. And so one of the reasons why, part of the deal of not getting persecuted all the time, and you do get persecuted some of the time in almost all cases historically if you're a minority religion, but part of the deal for not getting persecuted most of the time is no proselytizing, and certainly that's true for example, religions like the Mandaeans, who are a Gnostic sect that has been in Mesopotamia for the last couple thousand years, who traces their origins, whether the connection can be made or not, to John the Baptist. They also have a strict rule against proselytizing. The Samaritans, I think, don't proselytize. There's just a lot of religions that Zoroastrians, I think, don't. So it's a lot of times when a religion has ceased to be a national religion, is having to live as a minority religion, that gets impressed upon them, whether or not they've got an echo of that in their sacred texts. Rain also asks, was the death of many Israelites after making a golden calf simply reformist propaganda to scare people into henotheism at least? Well, so you're talking about the story in Exodus where after Aaron makes the golden calf, and then Moses says, "Who's on the Lord's side?" And the congregation of Dathan and Abiram, who have been the ones the entire time, who don't want to follow Moses and Yahweh anymore, who want their God, and they want to have a new God and take him back to Egypt and go back to Egypt where there was food instead of wandering in the desert. After Moses says, "Who's on the Lord's side?" the earth opens up and swallows all of those people directly to Sheol, the underworld. So that is a myth, not a historical event, as you say. So however you want to call that story. So the story is told probably, like you say, with the intent of telling people that you should be following Yahweh, like you say. So probably I think that your characterization could be supported. Winston Barquez says, were Eve and the Tree of Life antitypes of Asherah and her poles? Oh, and the Asherah poles. Oh, well, that's interesting. So when you're saying type and antitype, we're talking probably about typology and typological thinking. And certainly by the time we're getting to New Testament writers, the New Testaments are clearly thinking typologically. In other words, where they are seeing Old Testament stories, Hebrew Bible stories, as antitypes to Christ and other things in their own era. I don't know that we can say that the author of, essentially the J writer, the author, one of the core authors of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, I don't know that we can say that that's a typological thinker. It's an interesting idea. I don't know if there's I know that it's an established thing that's happening centuries later. I don't know if they're thinking typologically at all that kind of early. I think it's probably not, because I think that type and antitype is, I think it's probably not, because I think type and antitype is something that is being introduced certainly more in the philosophical time. So I think it's a Hellenistic idea that they wouldn't have access to. Michael Rogers, was polytheism more widespread before the Babylonian captivity and monotheism more prominent after exposure to Babylon Zoroastrianism? It's so definitely the polytheism is more widespread before, and monotheism grows in the Second Temple period and then becomes the religion in the course of the Second Temple period. And so even in the Second Temple period, as we were kind of mentioning, there were some Israelite religion where there's the temple in Egypt that has multiple gods, and so it's not entirely monotheistic. The development of schools like Second Isaiah and so forth are becoming monotheist, and so, but yes, it becomes more prominent. And so then, as you were pointing out, the fact that this is accelerating, or it definitely the trend continues and becomes total during the Persian period. It's something that's always telling, because the Persians, as you say, the Persian government is promoting its own world religion, the very early monotheist religion of Zoroastrianism, dualist monotheism. Michael follows up, is it true the Bible illustrates clashes between those taken to Babylon and those left behind? Yes, that's absolutely true. The Bible is very partisan. So the Bible is very in favor of those taken to Babylon, and it is contemptuous of those left behind. So in the story of Ezra, when the exiles come back to Jerusalem at the pleasure of the Persian emperor, who sends some of the exiles as officials and gives them funds to rebuild their temple, the local Israelites in the neighboring Persian province of Samaria say, hey, we want to help out. Welcome back. We missed you guys. We're ready to go. And then Ezra and his folks are like, oh, no way. You guys aren't Israelites. We're the Israelites. We're the true Israelites. You guys have been intermarrying. And that is presented as a deal breaker. And that causes the schism between the people who stayed in the land, especially the northern land of Israel, the Samaritans, and the exiles who return, who become the Judeans. Sarah Mansfield says, do we know where the ancient Israelites got this originating myth of having come out of Egypt, or what forms the story that they might have had earlier? So no, we don't. It's interesting. Yeah, we don't have that. So it is I've talked before, when you're having a an origin story as a people. And you turn to mythology because that's all you have in antiquity or even through the Middle Ages. Your story as a people is either you've always been here or you came from somewhere else, And so, the Romans, told the story that they came from somewhere else. Their myth is that fleeing Trojans came, as refugees from the Trojan War, and they went on this big rigmarole and got around, and they actually presumably adopted that myth incorrectly from the Etruscans. So that had also been like the Etruscan origin story. And the Romans liked it and they said, okay, well, we'll take that. Even though the Etruscans are an unrelated people, or they're somewhat related, but the Romans are a mixture. They're speaking an Italic Indo-European language, whereas the Etruscans are speaking an earlier language that had been in Italy before the Italic languages, before the Latins and Oscans and Umbrians and everybody else came into Italy. And so contrary to the reality is the Etruscans had that myth, but actually the reality is that they're actually probably from there, and there are what we call an autochthonic people that were always there and we can't trace from any earlier. And the Romans, although they took that origin story from the Etruscans, they aren't from a sea voyaging people that went around and arrived by sea. Rather, they're a Indo-European tribal people that came from across the Alps and invaded Italy at some point or other. Neither one of those, though, is their story. They have the other story that they took. So likewise, the ancient Israelites have at least two origin myths, which are both that they came from somewhere else. So the one of them is that they are from their ancestor Abraham, who comes from Chaldea in Mesopotamia. So he comes from ancient Sumer and Akkad and goes through the Fertile Crescent and comes down and finally comes into the land. And the other one is their other ancestor, Moses, brings them up out of Egypt. And so but whereas what archaeology kind of says is, nope, they're actually from there. So in fact, actually the Israelites emerge out of the Canaanites. So people don't know what the actual history is. In antiquity, they don't have the tools of history and archaeology that could tell them these things. They can only know their traditions. And they're probably just doing this with the reality that, when you are living in Canaan, when you're living in Lesser Syria, this is a tiny kind of place between two larger places that have all of this cultural influence. You have on the one hand Mesopotamia, and you have on the other hand Egypt. And Egypt is definitely, in previous centuries had been exercising imperial hegemony over Canaan, pre-Israelite times, and certainly continued to own the Levant at the time when the myth of the Exodus is supposed to happen. So they're wandering around and they stay in Egyptian empire when the thing is over in actual history. And so it doesn't work historically, but it probably is reflecting the idea that they have these two great influences, which are Mesopotamia and Egypt, and that's probably where they're coming up with where does their origin come from. Amanda Ray asks, is Leviathan possibly a description of a volcano? Has anybody ever posed that? I have never heard that posed. I always think I think Leviathan is pictured as a sea monster and representing chaos. So I would say that I would probably think of it that way as opposed to volcanoes. Volcanoes are chaotic too, but volcanoes have their own other place in ancient paganism. So Hephaestus, Vulcan, is hanging around underneath the giantess volcano in the Mediterranean, out under Mount Etna, and that's the forge of the gods, where he has this giant furnace that, and then it is also, volcanoes are sometimes maybe an entry point into the underworld, Hades or Sheol. So I don't think it's usually, I think the forces of the ocean are seen as chaos embodied, and so I think that's probably more what we're talking about. Operation Ivy 85 says, what do you think actually precipitated the merging of this pantheon into a monotheistic worldview? Why didn't this happen for other polytheistic religions? So in a lot of cases, so it doesn't not happen. So I mentioned, at the beginning of this about how in the Greco-Roman world, philosophers, centralize the religion by giving it a different philosophical background, cosmological background, and then also by adding ethics to it, which changed what the religion is. And so even if the Roman Empire had never converted to Christianity and it had continued to revere the old gods, or if after Constantine, his successor, one of the later successors anyway, Julian, who tried to revive paganism and put down Christianity, Julian the Apostate, if he had been able to create a church that venerated the old gods, I think that there would have been a lot of similarities with the Roman religion that emerges, whether it has the imagery and mythology of the old gods or whether it has the imagery and mythology of the Bible. And so I think that there's the same kind of thing is happening to create monotheism regardless of the mythology. I've gone to a lot of, for example, Hindu temples here in Toronto and the suburbs, where the leader of the temple will say to us when we're visiting that yes, there's a lot of gods, but they all believe in one God. In other words, there's a source, and that source is understood and shared the same way. Now, that may be a liberal, conceptual way that's presented in suburban Canada here, but it's sort of what I'm saying about how Hinduism has evolved into a world religion in reaction to the other monotheistic religions. You still have all of these gods with their different attributes, but in some ways, we have a lot of saints in Catholicism. You have the different angels. There's all kinds of different things that remain as semi-divine forms in monotheistic religions. So I do think that that is a process that happens generally anyway. Why did it happen in this case? I think that in this case, when you have these little tiny states, tribal city-states almost, they saw the advantage of having a royal cult where the king and priesthood centralize the religion and they destroy all the other high places, and they say, all of that has to occur here at the capital now. And so I think that is an impetus for this. You're centralizing the state. That involves then greater control, greater taxes over the land, greater control, being able to make armies and that kind of thing. And so I think that's the impetus for creating a henotheistic monolatry and then ultimately monotheism in this particular geographical and historical context. Nadav Kravitz says, question, is the Phoenician Canaanite pantheon related to the Babylonian or the Zoroastrian pantheons? Is it related to the Greek or Egyptian pantheons? So it's related to, the Canaanites and Phoenicians are both largely the same. Canaanites, Israelites, Syrians, Phoenicians are largely all the same people. They're the Western Semitic peoples. Their pantheon is related to the Babylonians, who are East Semitic peoples. So the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, and those also pulled from the Sumerians, who are not Semitic, but who exercised a lot of influence on those later religions. Those are less related to the Zoroastrian, Greek, and Egyptian pantheons. Zoroastrian is pulled, and originally anyway, from Persian religion, and the Greeks have their own, and the Egyptians have their own. Egypt is an ancient in its own separate culture, and the Persians and the Greeks are both Indo-European peoples whose gods kind of can maybe go back or be traced ultimately back to the same prototype that is hypothetical in the Indo-Europeans. But then they all interconnect with each other, and so sometimes the different gods get cross-pollinated. So, when I showed you all of those ones with the Greek and Roman gods, in some cases, these are very native. There's a very native Roman god like Mars, who is not particularly related initially to Ares, and they just get brought together, syncretized, because they're both understood to be a god of war. But Mars is a really important god in the Roman pantheon. Ares is less so in the Greek pantheon, just relative to how important Mars is. But a god like Apollo didn't exist in the Roman pantheon at all, and so that's just a Greek god that just makes his way to Rome and becomes patronized, especially by the Julian family, and so therefore just becomes installed at Rome. So likewise, the Greeks understood Adonis, which is one of the Semitic words for Lord, as being a transplant from the Middle East. And likewise, in the biblical period, in addition to when we're talking about all these different gods that are having in Canaan, there's also people that have shrines and figurines and things like that for Egyptian gods. So it's not like there's not, these aren't being spread around and the gods don't exist. And you couldn't have, it's not like you can't have a bunch of Canaanite gods and then have in your same temple an Egyptian statue. Certainly, like I was saying, the Romans certainly are doing that. The different people are doing that. So they don't have the same origins, but they syncretize together, and they can get along more easily than in other cases. With other world religions, for example. Jeffroli Evertinitz says, I'd like to know why Israel never seemed to have imperial ambitions, for example, to secure their borders during Ahab's time. So the problem for a place like Israel to have imperial ambitions is it's really tiny. And it's on land, so it's one thing for, let's say, a tiny place like Crete to be able to have kind of an empire, a Minoan empire, because they got a safe home base as long as they're the only ones that have boats and they're going around and attacking and maybe having an economic domination of all the Mycenaean cities and things like that. For a little tiny place like Crete, they can have an empire like that because they have the security of how can you attack them? It's like Britain, can rule the world because nobody can get them, when they own the Holy Navy and the whole planet, right? And so they are a country that barely has an army and isn't that big, and it has an empire of a third of the planet or something like that because it has the safety of a home base, that can be defended. A little tiny place like Israel, which is connected by land to much bigger places, like even like greater Syria. So Damascus, Aram, that area is much bigger than lesser Syria, Israel. And so that you're always in danger of getting attacked by even them, much less than all of Mesopotamia, which is able to be the center of a huge empire like the Babylonians or the Assyrians, or Egypt, which is a very good home base that you can always have and use to at least attack and take over Syria, which Egypt has done multiple times throughout all of history. And frankly, even in terms of the imperial sizes around there, the Hittites up in Anatolia. Anatolia is a homeland that can actually expand and create an empire. So the reason why they don't have any imperial ambitions is that it's just not a place to have it. It's too tiny to take over everywhere else. It's the kind of thing, if you took it over, then you suddenly wouldn't even be you anymore. It'd be like when a little place takes over a bigger place, the capital would transfer to Mesopotamia, because now suddenly that would be the center of your empire, because that's the big place. Lorenzo Sleestack asks, I'm curious about the word Elohim. I know it can mean gods plural, but does it also mean all the gods combined or divinity itself? So yes, I would say, because by the time it means God with a capital G, God is divinity itself, or God's self, and God is all the gods combined. And so again, the usage is weird, and we don't have any particular statements that are contemporary that explain why it's done that way. And even if we did, that might just be speculative because ancient etymologies are also usually pretty faulty. But kind of the speculate in terms of the actual sense of it and the meaning of it. Now that Elohim exists in that way in a text, that is now in the modern conception in Abrahamic religions as referring to God with a capital G, which is all gods combined and divinity itself. Aaron Wagner asked, were there multiple gods worshipped in the Second Temple period? So in the land itself, so for the returning exiles, this tamped down very rapidly. So I would say we don't have a lot of examples of it continuing very long. So ultimately, no. So the problem of that is described in the First Temple period Bible of everybody constantly being pagan, I think that describes the way things were. But once the exiles returned, there's a real focus on the one God and not the others. And that doesn't mean that everybody was like that. So they had to, the surrounding neighbors had multiple gods. So even people who, like the Edomites, who later became converted to Judaism, would have had multiple gods, and there also would have been multiple gods worshipped in the area around Galilee and things like that, and continued to be a pluralistic place. And like I say, Israelites outside of the central area in Egypt, exiles in Egypt, worshipped multiple gods longer. But the people who continued to be viewed as Judeans, as Jews, and also as Samaritans, people who were engaged in Israelite religion in the course of the Second Temple period became monotheists, absolutely, in that time period, so yes. Jeffroli Evertinitz asks, who were Israel's leading polytheist antagonists during Omri's reign? Polytheist antagonists, so do you mean the people who are antagonists of polytheists, or the people who are polytheists who are antagonists to Israel? So the way it's described in terms of we don't have history from that time, right? So the Bible texts that are written about, that are telling stories, it barely tells anything about Omri, but about Omri's son Ahab, this is written long after the fact. And so there might be some oral tradition that is being, that is fueling some of these myths, but I'd say largely these are myths. So this story that we have of Elijah fighting against the priests of Baal and the priests of Asherah, I don't know that we have names for all of those priests of Baal. We don't have a big antagonist named in the text that I remember, but that would be who it would be, I guess. Nevertheless, there's a myth. As I've tried to suggest, I think that actually in Israel, priests who are in favor of Baal and Asherah actually are also in favor of Yahweh. So it wouldn't be... So the antagonists of the royal centralizing program would have been local priests who have a traditional or older understanding, who don't like the new regulations that are coming out of Samaria, like out of Omri's capital. But that's just, I'm just suggesting that that's what it would be like, not that we have actual literary evidence of that. Andre Frere asks, why do you think when someone asked Einstein what would be his religion if he had one, he responded, polytheism? So in modern times, in the 20th century, or Einstein's kind of early 20th century guy who lived on, but anyway, there has been a big romanticism about paganism, polytheism. And the reason is that Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, in modern times have largely hewn to, very rigid, conservative, traditionalistic, but also doctrinaire and dogmatic and unthinking and fixed kind of ways, where clerics have gotten caught in their ruts. They have been they've fixated on an outdated medieval pictures of God and of theology, and they have also fixated on local social mores and pretended that those are somehow ethical or given by God. And so as a result of that, there has been a major, since the post-Enlightenment, there's been a major reaction against organized religion, which is appropriately against clericalism, because the clerics were in the wrong. and so when that happened, there was also a romanticism of the paganism or polytheism that went before the world religions. But actually, in real life, if you had a time machine and you went back there, you wouldn't like that. The polytheism, it would be, it's less thinking, it's more dogmatic. It has all of the things that you don't like about it. People just assume that, I don't know, because the Abrahamic religions have been so against sex and things that have been oppressed, and because of the Victorian era, especially, and how rigid things got in the Victorian age. In other words, right immediately before the 20th century, they assumed that it would have been, pagans with all of Zeus going around sleeping around would be much funner people to hang out with. But you aren't aware of all of the amount of religious stuff that comes with all of that. That's the thing that you would especially not like. So it would be even more rigid, and there'd be more obligation. It's not really the direction, but I can see why that romanticism happened. So as we're going to wrap up, I want to shout out to Benedict Bambil from Ghana. So we now have all the continents represented today in the live chat. Thank you for being with us. I also have more contributors to thank. So Andre Freer in Brazil, thank you for your support. And also Antti Turpainen in Finland, thank you for your support. So there's a final comment here. Unrecognized Talent says, recent convert from radical Catholicism. It's been a very hard mental transition, but Centerplace has really helped ease me through the transition. Thank you. Thank you, Unrecognized Talent. I'm so happy that we have been of some help at all in your faith journey, and we wish you the best going forward. So please continue to send your questions. We're going to address questions you can send as comments on our videos when we're doing that live Q&A on January 30th. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Like and share this video, subscribe to our channel. And again, if you're able, please consider a donation to centerplace.ca/donate. And just to remind you, next week we're going to talk about what caused the First Crusade. Bye.